Hello, everyone, and I'm Mike Underwood. I was one of the designers of Daggerheart, and today we're going to be talking about using and making campaign frames to be used with Daggerheart. This is not an official stream in any way, shape, or form. I am using the community gaming license to talk about what is in the game and how to make things for the game using the SRD that is available on the daggerheart.com website. So, disclaimers out of the way, we're done and solid. Now I'm going to jump over to my view here, and we're going to go up to see the Witherwild. Okay, so campaign frames. There's stuff about the campaign frames in the SRD, as we can see here over on the left, right? Campaign frames in bold. One campaign frame is included in the SRD for Daggerheart as of right now when I'm doing this stream. And it talks about some of these elements that a campaign frame will have. And then we get one example campaign frame, the Witherwild. Witherwild is not one that I am like a co-designer on. I gave some notes on it because there was a lot of back and forth and everybody supporting things during the process. I'm pretty familiar with the Witherwild, and so it will be a totally okay example to talk about. What I'm going to do today is we're going to walk through the elements of a campaign frame, why you might use a campaign frame and what they can do for your campaign. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the campaign frame that I'm working on right now called Bastion of Hope, which is a revolutionary fantasy campaign frame that I will be releasing using the community gaming license. So with all that, now I'm just going to go over to my own notes. So I have my notes over here, and then I have the things that are going to be on the video over here. We're streaming, baby. Campaign frames are, I think I described this on Tuesday, sourdough starter for building a campaign, right? There's a bit of material already there, and then you add more and work it yourself to create the fully fledged thing, right? Campaign frames will help you kickstart the process by honing in on genre, theme, tone, and some other elements. Campaign frames are intentionally left incomplete so that groups have a lot of room to make the setting their own, right? When I run 5 banners burning for an individual table, the version of that setting that exists for that campaign is going to be different than that setting will be, one, in the campaign frame by itself, and two, when anybody else is using it as the base for their own campaign, right? There are spaces left within it. We're trying to give you kind of the minimum viable product, or like just enough to get excited and get inspired, so that then you bring additional ideas to it, and you can get from, hey, let's do a campaign, to making some bigger choices about shared world building and character creation, so that you can then get moving forward in play, right? Building a whole setting is a lot of work. I should know because I've done it a lot as a novelist, right? And for Daggerheart Core, the decision kind of at the top level was that rather than shipping with kind of one specific campaign setting in mind, Daggerheart was going to have like a very light implied setting that is introduced mostly in like the introduction and the first chapter. But then we would have these campaign frames that give you an array of setting options and are meant to suggest that because Daggerheart isn't kind of bound to one particular setting in how the mechanical design works, it has the flexibility to go in a lot of different directions based on where you want it to go. And we're providing examples and tools in how you would do that through the campaign frames themselves, right? And so you can say that Daggerheart doesn't have a base setting, or we can say that it has 7 settings. right? The 6 campaign frames and the 1 very light implied heroic fantasy setting with the Hallows Above and the Realms of the Fallen and some of these other elements that are kind of sketched out at the beginning of the book to just kind of set expectations as a very light campaign frame default. And then when we go into it's chapter 5 in the book or the SRD over here, right, we can see this larger campaign frame structure. Campaign frames are not a substitute for like a multi-100-page campaign book. They're trying to do something different, right? Neither is necessarily better than the other, right? I'm not going to say, oh yes, campaign frames are better than the 300-page, impressively researched and meticulously written, edited, and art-directed campaign book. No. Those books are great, right? They're very exciting and inspirational, and for a lot of GMs, they provide a bunch of material that you can immerse yourself in, right? You can kind of gain mastery of, and then you have a breadth and depth of knowledge. Campaign frames are much more flexible, and by being shorter, they are easier to kind of take in and then expand, build out, and or kind of replace to fit your own needs. Right, that's something that I think is really nice, is really cool about campaign frames as we're doing them here. Right, this is not the only game or the first game to use campaign frames as a term or even a rough idea. I had been developing campaign frames for Let's Go Steal an Ending, the Genrenauts RPG, before I started working on Daggerheart. Right, but there's a bunch of different ways of doing campaign frames, and today we're going to talk about the one that is in Daggerheart. I think it's a good one. It's one that I've worked with. It's one that I'm going to keep working with in the project that I mentioned earlier, Bastion of Hope. And so now we're going to talk about the elements of a campaign frame. You can see an overview over here on this left-hand column. And I'm just going to run down what I have. So a campaign frame will have a name, a log line, right? That's a really short pitch. A complexity rating, a slightly longer pitch, notes on tone, themes, and touchstones, a broader overview of the kind of setting and campaign idea, player and GM principles that are added to the player and GM principles in Daggerheart, the core book. We have setting distinctions. This is usually a pretty big section because this lays out the kind of big ideas, factions, people, places, and things, cosmology elements of that setting, right? What are the biggest chunks of information that you need to know that are above and beyond an overview that kind of gives you a brief description of what's going on, right? And an overview can be half a page to a page, maybe 2 pages. The distinctions will often be 4, 5, 8, 10, 12 pages. In the core book, our campaign frames are of varying sizes, and the ones that have a higher complexity rating tend to be longer. It just kind of goes part and parcel. But there's no right answer for exactly how long a campaign frame should be. It's a question of what you're trying to do with it. In addition to those distinctions, right, we have an inciting incident, which is like a starting situation or adventure prompt, usually with a little bit of extra material to kind of give you the lay of the land of what that inciting incident plot might be like. It's not going to give you hard details about actually this happened and you have to do X particular thing in order to solve the puzzle so that you can save the day. It's much more like, here's a place to get started and some inspiration that then you're going to bring other ideas to. You're going to weave the individual characters' backgrounds and kind of features and themes into. We have special mechanics. These are the ways that the rules of Daggerheart are either changed or added to, sometimes both. And then the last parts that we will have in a campaign frame are the session 0 questions. Kind of add this to your session 0 process. And then in the core book, every one of these campaign frames has a map. So that's the quick overview. Now I'll go into more depth on each of these different elements that a campaign frame will have. Right, so if we jump back up to the top with the Witherwild on the right, Witherwild is the name. the quick pitch is that one sentence note here, right? The Witherwild is, when an invading nation attacks an ancient forest deity, a virulent overgrowth spreads throughout the land, right? This is like a strap line, a log line, a shout line. There's a bunch of different terms for this one sentence pitch or like tone setter, vibe setter. In campaign frames, we have the log line, the pitch, and the overview. And I think of these as a big, smaller, and smallest version of more or less the same idea, right? Each of these is trying to convey what is interesting and cool about the campaign frame. The log line at the beginning, right, that's the shortest one. Then you get the pitch, which is a bit longer, right? We see here that this is like a full paragraph. And then the overview is multiple paragraphs, possibly multiple pages. When you are developing a campaign frame, you might want to start from one sentence because that works. What works for you, or you might kind of describe the setting overall and then condense down to an overview, condense down further to a pitch, and condense down even further to that log line. Different people work in different ways. I tend to write more comprehensively and then hone down and revise my pitches, because having done the work gives me a stronger sense of what is important to convey about that work. And so I go from big to small because that lets me write a log line or a pitch line that is doing the most that it possibly can with the least amount of space and words, so that I believe that the log line to the pitch to the overview, that they're all going to be in sync, and each of them is going to be an accelerant or like a force multiplier to increase the amount of excitement and interest that somebody has in that campaign frame. Complexity rating for campaign frames go from 1 to 4. Complexity ratings are a combination of at least two big factors. One is how much the frame deviates from the kind of default heroic fantasy genre mode of Daggerheart, right? Daggerheart is written with a certain kind of home tone and genre. And then if your campaign frame diverges in genre and or tone, those are places in which using Daggerheart to tell that story will be more complex in some ways, right? You're going to have to adjust some of the mechanics or adjust and reflavor some of how things work, or you're going to want to make adjustments to fit the tone. In the Age of Umbra, the kind of survival fantasy campaign frame that Matt Mercer designed and is going to be showcased on the Critical Role channel starting tonight, the 22nd, right? That is dark fantasy, not quite grimdark as Matt has described it, but inspired by things like the Dark Souls series of games, Elden Ring, Kingdom Death Monster. And so it is grittier. The tone of the world is rougher, right? It's a really bad world, and then the heroes are trying to keep light alive, or trying to make things better. In kind of a default Daggerheart world where you're making a world that aligns with the implicit assumptions of the game, you're probably going to be more heroic fantasy than dark fantasy. You're going to be more kind of optimistic and adventurous than you are gritty and survivally, right? And so that's why Age of Umbra has a slightly higher complexity rating. The other element that goes into complexity is how much homebrewing and mechanical difference is involved in the game, right? How much homebrewing is running this campaign frame going to expect or likely to expect of the GM that's running it? How much are the mechanics of this campaign frame departing from the core game as written? So if we look at some of the examples in the book, right here in the SRD, we have the Witherwild at complexity 1. That means that it's not diverging very far at all from core Daggerheart. What it's giving you is a particular focus or subsection of the kind of heroic fantasy space with particular tone, feel, and themes, which we'll get to in just a second. Age of Umbra has a higher complexity rating. Motherboard, which is like a science fantasy post-apocalypse campaign frame, very much inspired by the Horizon Zero Dawn series of video games and the Mortal Engines books, right? For each campaign frame, there's kind of like one or two top order touchstones and then others that help round out the campaign frame. At least that's how I think about them. And so there's a campaign frame in the core book called Motherboard, and in that, all magic is science and technology, right? So that requires some reflavoring of a lot of the abilities. It means reimagining a lot of the adversaries or restatting them, adjusting them, doing some reworking, creating new adversaries. So that campaign frame, Motherboard, is complexity 3. Complexity 4, there's only one of those in the core book, and that's called Colossus of the Drylands. Colossus of the Drylands is a weird Western tech fantasy with giant monsters, right? The touchstones are things like the Shadow of the Colossus and Red Dead Redemption 2, right? So Weird West is pretty far from heroic fantasy. That we have the kind of science tech element with this material called Essentia, which is maybe comparable to something like materia in Final Fantasy VII. And we have big giant monsters, right? Whether you call them kaiju or titans, and in this setting, we call them colossi or colossus. So that's a big departure in genre. It's something of a departure in tone, right? Because there's a set of tones that are associated with monster stories, disaster stories, and with Westerns. And mechanically, the colossi are pretty complicated adversaries. They are individual adversaries with multiple stat blocks that represent different parts of the monster's whole. And there's a whole set of rules for how colossi interact in fights. And then there's some other mechanical adjustments, like here's stuff about your like kind of pistols and rifles and shotguns weapons that you can have because this is a Western. And here's material about the steeds that your characters might have and things like that. So Colossus of the Drylands is showing kind of where that outer edge of what you can do in terms of taking a campaign frame, still using Daggerheart, but making some pretty substantial moves across different axes to accomplish something different. So that's complexity rating, right? Darrington Press is not going to knock down your door and get you in trouble if you put out a campaign frame and you call it complexity 2 and other people might call it complexity 3. This is a rough guideline, right? To get a sense of where your complexity rating should be, right, you're going to want to refer back to the main book. In the SRD, we just have the Witherwild, and we're supposed to design new material based on the SRD, right? So start by referring to the SRD, build your campaign frame maybe, and then when you're trying to figure out what complexity rating to give it, you might then go look at the campaign frames in the core book and get a sense of where the thing that you've made sits in comparison to those, keeping all of those elements in mind. The next set of elements in a campaign frame I think of as kind of going all together, and that's tone and feel, themes, and touchstones. Right? So tone and feel for the Witherwild: adventurous, dynamic, epic, heroic, thrilling, uncanny, and whimsical. Right? So there's a bit of breadth and depth there, right? Thrilling and whimsical gives some contrast, right? Adventurous and uncanny gives some dimension. The themes are cultural clash, ends justify means, grief, people versus nature, transformation and change, and survival. So this is an indication of kind of the assumed or implicit thematic landscape of a campaign using this frame, right? It was built with these themes kind of in mind or kind of threaded throughout the material. It doesn't mean your game using a campaign frame has to only use those themes. It's just kind of what is is baked in, right? What the designers believe are the themes that are already evident or emergent from the material as is. And then touchstones are other works of media, right? This can be video games, it can be music, it can be other RPGs, it could be any number of things, right? A lot of the touchstones in the campaign frames in the core book are video games, films, TV, and things like that. All three of these together help set expectations for the campaign and help provide ways for players to orient themselves in terms of, oh, okay, right, I haven't read this, or maybe I skimmed it, but I have watched Princess Mononoke or Mononoke Hime, the film. Okay, I'm going to keep that in mind, right? Touchstones and shared touchstones especially are really good for getting a whole group on the same page in terms of what they imagine when they think about the world in their mind's eye, right? Whether that, and this is, again, I think I mentioned aphantasia on Tuesday. I'm trying to keep this in mind because it's like an important thing in terms of accessibility, right? I have a pretty vivid internal kind of canvas, but I know there are a lot of people who don't. But if you can think about your memories of what a touchstone looked like, sounded like, felt like, what you felt when engaging with it, those can all be really helpful because then you can reach for them when you're trying to think about immersing yourself in that setting, or you're trying to get a sense, trying to imagine how a character might be feeling, given that those touchstones kind of help comprise the kind of imagined space of the game, right? Touchstones are always, they can help you know what to do. For me, they shouldn't be constricting. They should be more like ways that you can then try to connect with one another. Being like, oh, well, this is kind of like this in The Legend of Zelda, and then I'm going to add something on my own. Or if somebody is unsure about a description, you might go, oh, well, this is kind of like this thing from Nazca of the Valley of the Wind, right? It can help you make sure that everybody's on the same page. So the next section is kind of like a character guide grouping: ancestries, communities, and classes. These are notes about what specific shape those character elements might take in this campaign frame, whether it is, oh yes, in this campaign frame, people who are Ridgeborn are more likely to XYZ. Or in this campaign frame, people who of this class are thought about in a certain way, right? If we go down in the Witherwild, we'll see communities, Loreborn and Highborn. In Fanewick, part of this setting, knowledge is the most valuable commodity, and those who have expertise have the most power. The economy of information functions primarily through gifting and trading, and wisdom would be considered acceptable collateral for a weapon or warm meal. As such, Loreborn community members are the wealthiest in Fanewick, and might be smaller, distinct groups of hunters, historians, or artisans within larger villages. Right? That gives you a sense of, oh, okay, if I want to be Loreborn in this setting, here's what that might be like. Or in this setting, things are like this, and so if you play someone who's Loreborn, you're going to be tapping into that. All these character guide sections tend to have extra prompts for characters, right? What knowledge did your community teach you that you must now protect or share? What are you able to accomplish because of your upbringing that others outside your community do not understand? These are like extra background questions that answering will help you kind of connect or align your character with the setting of the campaign frame. So we have these for ancestries, right? The kind of what your character looks like, their kind of the kind of what bloodline they come from, right? It's if your parents were elves and you're an elf, that's an ancestry. Ridgeborn is you grew up in a kind of mountainous or craggy community where navigating dangerous terrain was an essential part of life, and therefore the feature you gain is the ability to navigate dangerous or rough terrain, right? Ancestry is about who you were born at, like who you were born to, your physiological reality, what you look like. Community is how you grew up, your background, what culture informed who you are and your perspective on life. And then we have classes. These are the character classes, right? There's 9 in the core book. There's currently 2 in the Void, which is like a playtest section. Nothing that's in the Void is in the campaign frames in the core book. So that's just something to keep in mind. It may get updated, but it's not happening right now. And if it's happening, I'm not privy to it. So yeah, don't worry about that. If you are writing campaign frames now, you may not want to go ahead and try to include those classes because they may change in big ways before they're released. And to the best of my understanding, those classes are not in the SRD or public game material. So they don't fit within the current license in terms of making homebrew. Cool. So next we have the player and GM principles. So I'm going to keep on scrolling. So here for the Witherwild, we have the following campaign GM principles. Paint the world in contrast, show them true danger, offer alternatives to violence, and create multidimensional allies and adversaries. These are extra kind of tenets or guidelines or lodestars for GMs running this campaign frame to keep in mind, in addition to the standard GM principles that are in the core book. Similarly, there are a set of player principles over here. Make the invasion personal, treat death with importance, and embrace vulnerability. So these are for players to keep in mind and to think about as a way of understanding and interpreting what is happening in that campaign frame. Right? That if there's a scene where they come across a village where people have been killed due to kind of mutated monster attacks, well, as a player, you want to treat death with importance, right? And then when you're talking with somebody from that village and they're kind of sharing their heartbreak, you might think about how to embrace vulnerability, right? And to connect and empathize with that person, right? So these are just extra things to think about and ways to align your creative efforts and in your intention with that of the campaign frame. Okay, so the big one here, as I mentioned earlier, is setting distinctions. So distinctions are like the biggest, most important elements of the setting and the details about them that will help you have a springboard for building out your campaign. The distinctions generally build on and expand from the overview, right? So if a faction is mentioned in the overview, they might have a bigger write-up in the distinctions. If there's a note about how magic works in the setting in the overview, it might have its own distinction, right? The serpent's sickness is a distinction in the Witherwild because it's a major factor or event that is impacting the setting. Right? The weeks of day and night, this is just part of how reality works in the Witherwild, right? The gods of Fainwick distinction tells you, hey, here's how gods work in this setting. And then we get some examples of these gods of Fainwick. So here, the distinctions section is like a page and a half, thereabouts. You can have longer distinction sections. I don't know that I would recommend going shorter than this, just because there's kind of like there's a happy starting point, jumping off point, that I think campaign frames are most effective when they at least meet that level of support, inspiration, and structure. Your opinion may vary. That's totally cool. I won't get angry. So beyond the distinctions, we have the Inciting Incident. So this is like an example starting situation or adventure kind of plot hook or prompt to kick off a campaign using that frame. You are encouraged to use the Inciting Incident if you're playing with a campaign frame. It's certainly not required. And what it can do is help give you a sense of, okay, I'm thinking about the whole setting, but like literally what do we do when we're playing the game Daggerheart, right? Where do we start? When we've all caught up with each other on the first day after we've done session 0 and we've, put out the snacks, or maybe we've had a meal and we've caught up about everybody's day or week or month, and the GM says, okay, let's get started. What are they literally describing next, right? We're going to establish the setting, you're going to establish where the characters are, and we're going to kind of start getting the story rolling. So the Inciting Incident can help you do that. The Inciting Incident can also help you get a sense of, okay, you're going to do things like this in the campaign setting, and then here's where stuff kind of ripples out from that. And we see this in the Witherwild Inciting Incident, right? The party is sent an invitation from Haven to meet with Krail, but is his information correct? Does he have his own motivation or secret ambition? Right? What happens when they find the Fane Wraith? What are they going to do? And these are to help get the GM and then the party's imagination running, so that the Inciting Incident is the beginning of that snowballing that helps the story get rolling. So the last few bits are special mechanics, session 0 questions, and the map. Campaign mechanics can be as big or as small as you need them to be, right? Because the Witherwild is a complexity 1 campaign frame, it is not surprising that the campaign mechanics section is basically 1 bullet point, right? It's this corruption from the Witherwild, which takes up a few paragraphs, but represents kind of the entirety of how you have to change the way that Daggerheart works mechanically and like systems and features wise to play the Witherwild. Other campaign frames with a higher complexity will have 2, 3, 4, 5 bullet points of campaign mechanics, and any given bullet point section might be a little bit longer. In Five Banners Burning, the political military fantasy campaign frame that I wrote, right, there's several campaign mechanics, and most of them focus on kind of what these nation factions are doing and keeping track of their agendas and projects, right? So it added more of like a faction system or a faction turn, because you're talking about the fate of nations, right? And the characters are getting caught up in really big events, and I wanted to provide some tools for GMs to be able to keep track of what's happening at the kind of level of nations and these big factions more easily than feeling like they have to keep that as like the front of mind thing all the time, right? They can write it down. They can know that there's specific times when they're supposed to go and advance these different projects and countdowns. So that's how there's extra mechanics or different mechanics to support what the overall campaign frame is trying to do. In something like Colossus of the Drylands, the campaign mechanics section is really big because it's giving you, here's new weapons, here's the play cycle of fighting these colossi, here's what the big bad of the setting is trying to do using the colossi, and here's rules for how the colossi work as adversaries, right? They're their own special type of adversary. Here's some example colossi. Here's some special rules that they have. Here's a little bit of discussion about some of the special features that they have to kind of unpack them and make sure that it's really clear to be, so that you know how to use them, and kind of guidance overall about running fights or action sequences with these colossi. A more complicated campaign frame is going to tend to have more campaign mechanics and more kind of thoroughly unpacked or detailed kind of writing or rules within those campaign mechanics sections. We have session 0 questions. These are kind of catch-all extra prompts and things to consider when you are playing a campaign frame, a given campaign frame, right? So for the Witherwild, we ask, what dangerous animal comes out during the week of night that isn't out during the week of day? What unique trait, like an appearance, smell, or taste, does anything tainted by the Witherwild have? What superstitions does your character or their community have about traversing Fanewick during the long nights? Your character has witnessed something beautiful that came from the Witherwild. What is it, and how has it transformed their view of the corruption? Right? These are something that an individual character could answer. Each player could answer for their character. In some campaign frames, the session zero questions are addressed to the players and the GM. They're like questions about content or tone. Hey, like, how far are we going to go? Right? You know, if we have something that's like a survival fantasy, there might be a session zero question about like where you draw lines or kind of calibration or safety tools. In Five Banners Burning, there's a question that's like, how much are we going to focus on like a military aspect of what's happening in this campaign? Are the player characters going to all be working for the same nation faction, or are they going to kind of come from everywhere? Right? These are other questions that will help you think through what you need to get a campaign of that frame going. And then the last thing that's included in the book is maps. I don't know that the map for the Witherwild is in the SRD. Having a map for your campaign frame can be really handy. The ones in the core book have a map with a few places kind of named, but then there is a pick list, as I believe that term, I first know of it in RPGs from Powered by the Apocalypse games, right? Here's a big list of place names. And then when you're doing shared world building, the idea is that you pass the map around the table and people will pick something from that list of names, write it on the map, and then talk about what that is, kind of creating or adding a new place or element to the setting. So that then after you've gone around the table and everyone has added to the setting, there's a shared understanding of what the setting is, and there's a shared sense of ownership, which I really love. So that is a, let's say, 35 to 40 minute overview of what campaign frames are. I want to talk a little bit more about how to use them, right? You're starting a campaign and you're trying to figure out, do I want to use a campaign frame? If so, do I want to use one of the ones that's in the book, or, you know, depending on when this is, something that's been released as a third-party campaign frame? Do I want to make my own campaign frame? What are the upsides and downsides of that? And then I want to talk a bit about Bastion of Hope, which is the new campaign frame that I'm working on. Okay, so using campaign frames. You don't have to, is the biggest, most important thing. If you don't want to use campaign frames, the game will work perfectly fine without. What you might want to do, if you're not going to use a specific campaign frame, is just read through one or two of the campaign frames and think about how the material that's in those could help somebody get a campaign of that frame going, and then how you might satisfy some of those same needs, right? What questions do you need to ask the group that you're playing with in terms of tone, or like what a party is going to be, right? The connection questions we have are really good at tying PCs to one another, but they don't automatically establish why this full set of people is an adventuring party, or why this full set of people are all working together. And so you might want to come up with a specific question to address that. If you're going to do any homebrew, right, it might be useful to write down any changes to the rules so that the players have that as reference, right? Those elements overlap with what a campaign frame is. Using them doesn't mean you have to do the rest of the campaign frame things, but the campaign frames as a structure are built with particular intention, right, to provide types of support. In terms of picking which campaign frame you want to use, right, I would recommend just kind of going in order within a given campaign frame. Look at that splash piece of art, get a sense of what it makes you feel, like does it get you excited? Then read that first page or two that will give you the log line, the tone, the touchstones, the themes, and, a little bit larger of a pitch, and see if you think that that is something that you are excited about. And if you're excited about that, that's a great first step. Do you think that the people you're playing with would get excited about it? Another thing you can do is you can just either have your players read the campaign frames on their own, right? Just say, hey, can you read like the first 2 pages of each campaign frame and then tell me which ones you like? Or if you are playing online, right, you might be able to share some of the material with the players and have them read things, or you could just do an overview yourself. If you've just, if you haven't decided or haven't talked about a campaign frame before you get to session 0, that may be a really good thing to do pretty early in that process, because it's going to inform a lot of the other steps of session 0, including character creation. If you've committed to using a campaign frame, I think one of the next important things to keep in mind is that you can take what you want, take what is useful to you, leave the rest. But if you are excising things or if you're making big changes, I think it's good to reflect on how those changes, whether that's omission or revision, how those things then fold back onto or work in concert with what is already there in the campaign frame and you're planning on using, right? How does the setting change if I tweak how corruption from the Witherwild works and I make it harsher, right? I'm going to take the Witherwild and push it toward more like a dark crystal tone where things are a bit more dire. Do I need to then look at other things and change stuff in the setting right up or anything else that reflects that change that I'm trying to make to tone? You can use the Inciting Incident, or you cannot use the Inciting Incident, right? You can use the Inciting Incident as inspiration and then come up with your own. I would especially encourage GMs who are using campaign frames to do this session 0 with the players, take note of those background, or the answers to their background questions and their connection questions, pepper in some of those extra questions from the character guide section, right? Ancestry, community, class, some of your overall session 0 questions, and then keep those answers and your notes about them in mind when you're thinking about building that first kind of place to begin the story, or your first plot arc. If you're using the Inciting Incident, are there places where you can tweak it to have a stronger direct tie-in or hook or emotional buy-in for the characters that you have? Do you want to replace one or another of the NPCs with an NPC that is established in a character's background question or is implied by some other bit that the group has discussed? Is there some element that you want to add to make that story or that plot line engaging to a player character who you're not sure would otherwise be as excited or drawn in by what you have, right? Do you need to add something? Do you need to take away something that was discussed by the group as like, we're really not interested in X thing? And you're like, oh, well, X is in the Inciting Incident, so I probably want to replace X with something else. And once you get started, how much you refer back to the campaign frame is really, again, up to you, right? If you want to keep using the mechanics that are written out and have those be consistent, you'll probably keep referring to those. Or you might want to grab that onto a separate document or something, or print out just that section because that's what's important. And maybe it's more player facing as well. And then the rest of the stuff can recede to the background, right? Your version of the setting is going to end up a bit different, or maybe a lot different from what is written in the kind of the published material. If you are running a game and you want to build a campaign frame for that campaign as reference for yourself and for players, that can be really cool. It can help you organize your thoughts because, again, this is just structure. It is a suggested structure that is intended to make it easier to get your campaign going, right? And so if you're building your own campaign frame, you might write down the character guide stuff, basically the first 2 pages through the overview, and then the character guide stuff, and you just give those to the players, right? You don't overload them with the like, here's 6 pages about my distinctions right away, right? You could start them with, here's the kind of basic information to know about playing a game in this setting, and then gauge with the players when it makes sense to give them additional setting material if you want to, or if they're asking for it. Maybe you don't need to give them the distinctions right away because some stuff you want to kind of keep soft to be able to tweak and, throw out or replace once you get going. Where it's like, well, the overview mentions this one place that's over somewhere else on the map, but we're not going to get there for a while, and so that gives you the chance to reserve the right to change it, especially if the way things are going are a little bit different than what you were expecting when you were doing your earlier prep and writing your campaign frame material. You might go, there's this theme element that a lot of the players seem really excited about, and I don't know that my plan or what I had written delivers on that or interrogates that, investigates it as much as I would like to. So what can I tweak or add or replace that will help me connect the players or plug them into this thing that reflects and manifests that theme that they seem to be really excited about? One of the principles in the core game is hold on gently. Right? You don't need what you wrote in the campaign frame to be rigid, canon, unquestionable. If there's stuff that you want to be solid, that's fine, right? Communicate where you can the stuff that you're more set on, in the places where you're either happy to play to find out what happens, or you're fine letting it be a little bit more squishy, a little more vague, or that you're letting the players kind of decide how they want it to be, right? If you've got a firm opinion on a player side and you didn't have a strong preference as the GM, right? Maybe it makes sense to let their preference take precedent here, especially if nobody else has any strong feelings, right? Might as well satisfy folks where you can, if doing so causes zero problems for anybody else, right? As long as everybody is getting to have a good say in the setting and how things go. Okay, so that's almost an hour, and now we're going to come back to me. Don't worry about that. That was a very brief break that was definitely intentional, and was not me tabbing over to get my notes about Bastion. All right, so I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it over here, and then we're going to go back here. Okay. So for this, I'm not going to be showing my screen because what I can show you is just much rougher and not as pretty. And it's got like Word document comments in it. So just bear with me. As I take a moment here. Okay. So Bastion of Hope is a revolutionary fantasy campaign frame. And I'm just going to kind of give you the first page or two worth of stuff, honestly. All right, I'm going to move this over here as I realized that the formatting I was using was a little bit different than what I think I actually want to use. Okay, so name is Bastion of Hope. And then that log line, that very short description, is dragons and necromancers rule the world with sorcery and spite. But in the newly free country of Bastion, a defiant few stoke the flames of revolution. Right? This is, if you wanted to pick a very specific fantasy subgenre, right, this would be hope punk. Hope punk is like, there's a lot of embattled contestation about it. But if that's a term that is useful to you, then, let's use it in this particular case. If you hate hope punk and think that it's really bad and want to start a fight about it, let's not. So the complexity rating for Bastion of Hope right now is 2. It is a bit more complicated than a baseline. The biggest changes are in some of how magic works in the world and some features that player characters get, right? I have a rule right now in the campaign frame where the player characters all get special boons from the goddess that's kind of the patron of this revolution. And as you go up in tier, those boons will give you new features, right? And so that's additional, that's a change to the rules, right? In the core book, there are not divine boons that scale up per tier. You might have the domain of splendor, which you interpret as divine power, but this works differently. So there's a little bit of a tone shift, right? We're going toward hope punk defiant revolutionary fantasy and away from high adventure fantasy, right? The setting is more the bad guys won a long time ago, and now a group of heroes is emerging to try to push back and depose these overlords that have been in charge for a long time to make the world a better, nicer place for more people to live with, where more people are able to determine their own way of living instead of having it being dictated to them. So the slightly longer pitch for Bastion of Hope is the world is controlled by a handful of dragons and undead overlords. They rule bustling cities where precarity keeps workers hungry and desperate, the promise of prosperity driving them onward, right? If I just work a little bit harder, if I just get through this pay period. In the setting, there are these huge power siphoning obelisks that sap away the inherent magic of people within their radius. In this setting, everybody has magic to some degree, but very few people know that because almost everybody lives within the range of these obelisks, which takes that magic away and they don't get to experience using it. Those obelisks feed the magic power to the overlords, and then those overlords dole it out or use it in like magic industry to create magical artifacts and devices. So that magic allows the overlords to dole out power to their enforcers and spies. And then after centuries, one nation has shattered the towers in this one region and slain its draconic overlord. But this new country needs champions. Will you? And then we have the kind of like a call to arms, right? Will you take up arms against the wealthy, even though their vassals outnumber you 1,000 to 1? The tone and feel of Bastion of Hope is defiant, tense, and uplifting. The themes are authoritarianism, community, isolation versus interdependence, and revolution. The biggest touchstones are the D&D setting Eberron and the setting of Dark Sun, Final Fantasy VII. For this, it's kind of like parentheses, the original and the remakes to different degrees. The role-playing game Exalted, the video game Metaphor Refantasio, and I think this is the 2000s era dark fantasy setting Midnight, which was often pitched as Lord of the Rings if Sauron won, right? And so this has some of that like traditional fantasy villains won, and now we're doing something far later. Bastion of Hope, I think, is more optimistic about a world becoming better than what I remember from Midnight, but it's been a long time since I read that book, so right, it's in there as a touchstone, but I think the biggest ones are probably Dark Sun and Metaphor Refantasio, maybe Final Fantasy VII. They're all in there. I trend toward a plurality of touchstones and influences, right? I take little bits from a lot of different places, and then I'm expressing my own creativity by how I put them together, what I do and don't take from any given influence, and what I want to try to do with them. And then to give just a little bit more information about the setting. So the overlords took over like a millennia ago when the gods departed from the mortal realm, right? You know, we had the creation and there was a divine age where the gods were kind of more present in everyday people's lives. And then the gods decided to absent themselves from the affairs of mortals. There's still some divine magic in relics and blessings and sacred places, but the gods have been away for a long time. And when the gods left, dozens of dragons from around the world used like the wealth and influence that they had built to launch a massive multi-front war and take over the world, right? Who could stand against dragons, especially if your neighbor is also fighting a dragon, so they can't come and help you. And the dragon has also been undermining your economy by flooding it with money to devalue your currency because they have a huge hoard, or they've been buying spies and moles, right? If you're a dragon and you've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you have the knowledge and magical skill, physical prowess of a giant apex predator, and centuries to plan, what are you going to end up doing? You're going to be really dangerous. Over time, some of the dragons were killed by one another, or died, or just decided to stop being an overlord, and those domains were either taken over by a different dragon or by various undead kind of powerhouses, right? Liches, spirits, white lords, skeleton kings, good vibe stuff. We're adding some of that midnight, some elements of dark fantasy, right? The world is rough, so the heroes have to be even more heroic. But it's a setting where things are bad, but they can get better, and you should believe that they can get better, and that your belief that they will get better is part of what fuels the character so that you make it happen, as opposed to, well, things are really terrible. People are worth fighting for, even if we're not expecting much. In Bastion, right, the revolutionaries have deposed a dragon. They did what no one had done in centuries. And so there is hope. And as a result, the other overlords are going, oh, well, we can't have that. And so Bastion is in a lot of trouble. Therefore, new heroes are needed. Enter the player characters. So this revolution was enabled by a group of kind of devotees of Chore, the goddess of justice, one of these kind of absent gods. Through their devotion to her and their desire for kind of freedom from this dragon, were inspirational enough, or were able to kind of open up a channel that then Chore returned her gaze to the world and was like, actually, screw this non-interference pact. Things are terrible. Justice and revolution is my whole thing. And so she kind of broke that interdiction at the cost of a lot of her power, but that left her with enough to imbue a small number of mortals with these divine boons, and they became known as chain breakers. With that power, they were able to destroy this domain's towers that sapped away magic, and with then that larger group of people kind of in a bigger revolution, were able to depose the Dragon Lord, right? And so now we have this nascent fledgling nation where people are in charge of their own affairs, right? It is a fledgling republic instead of an autocracy, which is what basically every other domain is. The player characters are some of these newly chosen champions, new chain breakers. And there's a bunch of problems and challenges. Some other chain breaker is kind of going to be their quest giver NPC by default, right? But they may be doing stuff to shore up Bastion's resources. They might be infiltrating another nation to try to foment rebellion there. They may be trying to sabotage the obelisks in some other area, or they might be intercepting and undermining some overlord's attempt to build a new tower into the area of Bastion to siphon magic away again, so that then that overlord's forces can take over, overthrow Bastion, and kind of claim it as part of a now expanded domain. So that's kind of that's the 10-15 minute pitch for Bastion of Hope. There's more material that I've already written up, right? There's character guide stuff about ancestries, communities, and classes. There are player and GM principles. There are several pages of distinctions. A lot of these are write-ups of the different domains and their overlords, so that you know kind of who's in the neighborhood regionally and what types of threats they might create for Bastion, and places you might go if you want to try to spread the revolution. I've got stuff about the obelisks, Bastion itself, how the kind of stolen magic works, the chain breakers, including some like really short write-ups of here's some potential chain breakers who are still around as kind of notable NPCs or like sub-faction leaders. And then there's an inciting incident party kind of, or a plot hook. And then we've got a fair bit of campaign mechanics, right? There's rules on innate magic, right? Everybody has some amount of magic. The divine chainbreaker boons that player characters get, how the obelisks work, and then I have some other places where I might add a little bit more or some other things. And then I've got my session 0 questions. You can get this full work in progress document right now by going to my Patreon. And that's at an address that I'm going to write down. And it's going to be on the screen. So at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. That's just the letter R. So if you go there, if you sign up for any, basically any paid membership level, right? That's $2 and above per month. You can get access to the full write-up that I have right now. It's a work in progress document. I will continue to post updates about this campaign frame for paid patrons. And then when I have a bit more polished version, right, that might be available at a slightly higher tier, and then I might start selling it on like itch.io and DriveThruRPG. And then I've got a variety of plans for publishing third-party material compatible for meant to be used with Daggerheart. But there's a number of kind of moving pieces, and I wanted to get something in front of people's eyes like pretty quickly, because I know that people are hungry for material, and right, different campaign frames will help different people. And I'm hoping that by doing this stream and talking about what I'm working on, how I'm doing campaign frames, how I see the way that you build and use them, that will make it easier for other folks to get the most out of campaign frames, whether they are using existing campaign frames, adapting them, creating new campaign frames just for their own individual campaigns, or building new campaign frames to publish. So that is all of that. I also do want to shout out a creator who has built homebrew campaign frame templates, or a homebrew campaign frame template, and that is the creator ffwydriad.itch.io. And these are homebrew campaign frame templates, and I've got the link there in my chat. I just saw this today. I downloaded it. It is a Word docx template. So it's not super fancy, but it absolutely does the thing. And if what you're mostly looking for is some help to make the layout just a little bit sharper, or to have a structure to build from, this will get you going. Currently it is listed, it is a name your own price. I'm going to go back and throw this creator some money, because I think this is a great start, especially for people who don't have like formatting and layout skills and or training. I have enough formatting and layout skills and training to know that it's a pain, and to appreciate when other people have already done it. And so then I want to send them some love, both in doing this stream and, when I go and pay for it myself. So that is what I have for today. So we talked about how campaign frames work, what is in the SRD for Daggerheart about campaign frames, how and why you would use them, building and using your own campaign frames, and then some about Bastion of Hope, the campaign frame that I'm working on and you can get at my Patreon. So that's all that. We're done for the day. I am going to stream again tomorrow, because my excitement about Daggerheart is still very large and cannot be contained in any one stream. I was more coherent today than Tuesday, because I had slept better and been over the initial launch day ups and downs. But tomorrow what I want to do is talk about environments, which is a part of Daggerheart that I did a lot of work on. I'm really proud of. I think where we ended up is very cool. And I think that there's stuff you can do with environments that can really help a variety of play styles and GMs and are a fun place to do homebrew. And so we're going to talk about that tomorrow. And my intention is to also do some homebrewing of environments on the stream itself. So that could be extra fun if you are interested in environments show up live, or like this stream, you can catch it later on YouTube, which maybe is how you're watching it right now. So that is all for today. The stream tomorrow, if you are around, is going to be again at 1 p.m. Eastern. It's probably not going to last more than an hour and a half or 2 hours, because this weekend is also Balticon, and I will be doing some programming on Friday and then throughout the weekend. And then this coming Monday, I am typing. On Monday, I am going to be GMing a charity one-shot of Daggerheart for ArvCon, which is a fundraiser convention weekend for the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation, run by my friend Arvin Elleron, which is his Twitch stream name. He publishes as Gregory A. Wilson. I have run charity one-shots for ArvCon for a few years. I took last year off because I was kind of in full Daggerheart mode. But I'm happy to be back, and I'm going to be running a game for some of the scientist fellows of this foundation, right? And these are folks who have varying experiences with RPGs. And it's been fun to get to be the person who introduces folks to at least a type of role-playing game. And I look forward to doing that, and I hope that I will see you there, depending on, or if you're watching before the fundraiser, I hope to see you there. And if you're watching after, I hope you will go back and watch that stream and then maybe consider donating to Damon Runyon anyway, even though it's not the convention weekend. Understanding that there's a bunch of places that need financial support because things are rough in the world. So put your money where you can, spread the word, all that good stuff. Thank you for being with me, and I'll see you next time.